For 2 weeks, the billionaire's little granddaughter sat in silence at the dining table, growing thinner every day, staring at untouched plates, while doctors, specialists, and therapists insisted she was shutting down from grief, and a grandfather begged God for anything that might reach her. Then the new nanny arrived, a quiet young woman with her own scars from childhood loss, and instead of coaxing or pleading, she sat beside the starving girl, took a slow bite of simple bread, and whispered something so gentle it made the child finally lift her eyes. What happened next left the entire house in stunned tears. The Oliver penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan like a glass fortress standing against the winter wind. At sunrise, the water below shifted from dark steel to pale silver, and the sky turned the color of cold ash. Inside the penthouse, everything was silent. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that followed heartbreak, the kind that felt heavy and unmoving. James Oliver walked through the wide hallway with a cup of untouched coffee in his hand, feeling like he was walking through a museum of a life that no longer belonged to him. His daughter's toys were still in their places, her drawings still taped to the fridge, her tiny shoes lined by the door, but the laughter that once filled every corner had vanished the day her mother died. James paused at the doorway of the dining room. The same dread climbed his chest every morning. Sophie sat at the table, small shoulders, slumped eyes distant. A plate of soft, scrambled eggs lay in front of her untouched. The steam had faded long ago, yet she didn't seem to notice. She didn't notice much of anything anymore. 6 months ago, she had been a bright child running through this penthouse, with giggles echoing like bells. Now she sat still, staring at nothing. James took a step forward and felt the familiar ache twist behind his ribs. "Good morning, sweetheart," he whispered, though she didn't lift her eyes. She hadn't eaten in 2 weeks. Not one bite, not even a sip of juice. The doctors said children process grief differently, but James feared what those empty days were doing to her tiny body. Mrs. Chun entered quietly, carrying a fresh tray, though she already knew Sophie wouldn't touch it. She had worked for the Olivers for 20 years and had known Sophie since birth. Seeing the little girl shrinking into herself broke something inside her. She set the tray down softly, praying that this morning would be different. She placed a gentle hand on James's arm. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His eyes said everything. They said he was losing his daughter inch by inch, and he didn't know how to stop it. 6 months earlier, the world had shattered in one phone call. Catherine Oliver driving home from the grocery store. A truck running the red light. No warning. No chance. James remembered the police at his door. The look in their eyes before they spoke. He remembered falling to his knees in the hallway, unable to breathe. But what haunted him most was telling Sophie. She didn't understand the word gone. She didn't understand heaven or accident or forever. She only understood that her mother walked out the door and never came back. The next morning, she stopped talking. 4 days later, she stopped smiling. 2 weeks later, she stopped eating. And now James sat across from her every day, watching the light fade from her eyes, like a candle burning its last. He hired the best specialists in Chicago, then flew her to New York, then Boston, then Los Angeles. Child psychologists sat with her for hours, asking gentle questions she never answered. Feeding experts tried games, rewards, sensory strategies. None of them reached her. It was like Sophie had locked herself behind a glass wall and refused to return. She barely looked at her father. Sometimes she seemed to look through him. James tried everything. Storybooks, toys, songs she had loved, soft prayers whispered into her hair. Nothing worked. He held her small hand and begged her to eat, but she kept her lips closed as if food itself hurt her. Every day she grew thinner. Every night James cried, alone in his office, trying not to wake her. On the morning Jessica arrived, the penthouse felt colder than usual. The air tasted like sorrow. She entered through the service elevator guided by Mrs. Chun. She was young but carried herself with quiet steadiness. Her coat was worn and her shoes scuffed from long commutes across the city. Jessica stood in the massive kitchen, feeling out of place. The gleaming marble counters, the high ceilings, the lake view stretching into the distance. Nothing in her life had looked like this, but grief had a way of making all people equal. When Mrs. Chun explained the situation, Jessica didn't gasp. or look horrified. She only nodded slowly, eyes soft, because when she was 7 years old, she had felt that same hollow cold that lived behind Sophie's eyes. Jessica washed her hands and began preparing breakfast. The knife moved gently against the board. The fruit she sliced was colorful, bright, full of life, but inside the kitchen, the silence made everything feel muted. When Mrs. Chun returned with the uneaten tray from upstairs, Jessica felt her stomach sink. Cold eggs, untouched, toast stiff, food that never had a chance. Jessica asked how long it had been. Mrs. Chun whispered 2 weeks, since she had eaten, and months since she had truly lived. Jessica thought of her own mother's funeral, the way she pushed away every plate, her grandmother, prepared because nothing tasted right. And your heart was broken. She understood Sophie more than anyone else in that house. A slow, heavy step sounded from the stairs. James appeared in the doorway wearing the same dark suit he had worn 3 days in a row. His eyes were sunken, and his hair uncomb. He poured coffee without speaking. Jessica greeted him softly, and he looked at her as if remembering she was hired the day before. "How long do you think you'll last?" he asked quietly. The words weren't cruel. They were tired, worn from grief. Jessica held his gaze. "As long as she needs me to." Something flickered across his expression. Surprise. Maybe even hope, though faint. He nodded and left the room. Jessica spent the morning cleaning counters that didn't need cleaning, trying to learn the rhythm of the household while her mind stayed focused on the little girl upstairs. Around 10, another breakfast tray returned downstairs, untouched. Mrs. Chun tried to smile, but her eyes were red. Jessica watched the cold eggs slide into the trash and understood deeper than words that Sophie wasn't resisting food. She was resisting life. Jessica whispered a small prayer under her breath. "Lord, if you brought me here, show me what to do." Upstairs, Sophie sat on the floor of her pale blue bedroom, knees to her chest, staring at a photo on the wall. Her mother smiling, holding her. Jessica stood in the doorway quietly. The girl didn't move. Jessica walked inside slowly and sat on the floor too, but several feet away, giving the child space. She didn't speak. She didn't coax. She simply existed in the same hurt silence Sophie lived in. Eventually, she whispered a soft truth. "When I was your age, my mommy went to heaven too." Sophie's eyelashes twitched, barely. But it was the first spark of life Jessica had seen, and she stayed there with the little girl until the sun dipped low in the sky. That evening, James passed the bedroom and froze. He had not seen Sophie look at anyone in months, but she was looking at Jessica. Not speaking, not smiling, but seeing. A fragile beginning, a thread of connection. James stepped away quietly so he wouldn't break whatever fragile miracle was forming. For the first time in months, a tiny shift echoed through the home, a door opening inside a child's heart. A breath returning, and in that moment Jessica understood something deep and unshakable. Sophie wasn't refusing food. She was refusing life itself. And unless someone reached her, not as a doctor, not as a specialist, but as a person who knew grief, she might slip away completely. Jessica whispered another prayer as she left the room. "Help me show her. She's still here." And somewhere in that quiet house, the first seed of hope planted itself. The next morning began before sunrise, with a cold gray light creeping over Lake Michigan and into the Oliver penthouse. Jessica stepped through the service entrance, carrying the weight of a night with little sleep. She kept seeing Sophie's hollow eyes, the way the child stared through rooms, like she wasn't part of them anymore. Jessica pulled off her coat and breathed in slowly, trying to steady herself. She didn't know exactly what to do, but she felt a pull inside her, the kind she had learned to listen to since childhood. Something in this house needed tenderness. Something simple. Something true. Mrs. Chan was already in the kitchen arranging fruit on a plate, though she knew the girl wouldn't touch it. Her hands moved slowly, as if every apple slice carried grief in it. Jessica approached quietly. The older woman gave a tired smile. "You are early." Jessica nodded. Couldn't sleep. She reached into the pantry and took out bread, cutting board butter. Mrs. Chun watched in surprise. "Breakfast," she whispered, "but not what is on the plan." Jessica shook her head. Plans had not helped. Fancy meals prepared with love and fear had not helped. Sophie didn't need nutrients. She needed connection. James entered the kitchen moments later, still in his running clothes, hair damp from sweat. He looked exhausted, like a man who had been carrying a boulder on his chest for months. He noticed what Jessica was preparing, and his jaw clenched slightly. That is not what her nutritionist approved. Jessica kept spreading butter on the bread, speaking gently. I know, sir, but she isn't eating what they approved. So maybe something simple as the bridge she needs. James frowned, yet something in her tone softened him. He leaned against the counter, rubbing his temples. If this doesn't work, then I cannot take another disappointment. Jessica nodded, understanding the tremble in his voice. Sometimes the smallest things are what the heart remembers. As the grilled bread sizzled in the pan, the warm smell filled the kitchen. Mrs. Chun closed her eyes, breathing it in. She whispered that Catherine used to make grilled cheese for Sophie on Sundays after church. Jessica froze for a moment. That was not in any file or report. That was not something a doctor could know. That was memory. That was home. Jessica flipped the sandwich carefully, her hands gentle. Maybe that is the string we pull, she murmured, and somewhere upstairs a thin, fragile string of memory stood in a little girl's chest. Jessica carried the plate upstairs with both hands, heart pounding as she took each step. The hallway felt long, as if holding its breath. Photographs lined the walls, snapshots of a life that had felt whole once. Sophie as a baby, Sophie in pigtails, Sophie in her mother's lap. Jessica paused at one picture where Catherine held her daughter cheek, pressed against cheek, both smiling with pure joy. For a moment, Jessica touched the frame lightly. Then she whispered a small prayer. Lord, guide me, please. Sophie's bedroom door was cracked open just an inch. Light from the hallway stretched across the carpet toward her small figure sitting in the same place as yesterday, knees pulled to her chest. She didn't look up when Jessica entered. Jessica set the plate not in front of her but at a respectful distance, then sat in her usual spot on the floor about 6 feet away. She didn't speak at first. She let the smell of warm butter drift through the room, letting it settle like a memory. After a moment, she picked up one triangle, softly took a slow bite, and chewed like there was nowhere else she needed to be. Sophie's eyes moved, barely noticeable, but unmistakably drawn to the soundless rhythm of Jessica eating. Jessica swallowed, then whispered, My grandma used to make this for me after my mama went to heaven. Sophie blinked, a tiny fragile movement like a door opening a crack. She whispered, My mommy made those too. Jessica felt her chest tighten. I know. Mrs. Chun told me. She did a good job. You can taste love in it. Sophie stared at the plate, and her breath trembled. Jessica leaned forward just a little. You do not have to eat it, Sophie. You do not have to do anything for me. I am just here with you. That was all. No pressure, no fixing, just presence. Sophie looked at her hands, small fingers twisting together. Then she whispered, almost afraid if I eat it, will I forget her? Jessica felt tears burn behind her eyes. Never, baby. Eating it means you remember her, because this was something she shared with you. Every bite is like telling her you still love her. Sophie reached out, hesitated, then picked up a piece. Her fingers shook, her eyes filled with tears. She brought the bread close to her face, smelling it like she was searching for home in it. Then with a breath that broke in the middle, she took the smallest bite. Tears spilled instantly down her cheeks as she chewed, slow and painful. The moment she swallowed, something inside her cracked open wide and she dropped the sandwich and sobbed into her hands, sobs that sounded like they had been locked in her ribs for months. Jessica slid closer and wrapped her arms around the shaking child, letting her cry into her chest. Sophie clung to her tiny fingers, clutching handfuls of Jessica's shirt as she choked out broken words. I miss her. I miss Mommy so much. Jessica whispered, I know, baby. I know. Let it out. She held her, rocking her gently as the grief poured out like a storm, finally breaking. And in the doorway, James stood, frozen tears streaming down his face, watching his daughter come back to life. The grilled cheese stayed on the plate, half-eaten, but for the first time in 2 weeks, Sophie had eaten something. But more importantly, she had felt something. She had opened her heart, even if just a little. James stepped into the room, slowly kneeling beside them. Sophie saw him through tears. Daddy, she whispered. James's heart shattered. I am here, sweetheart. I am right here. He placed a hand on her back and felt her small frame shaking under his palm. She did not pull away. She leaned into him too, and in that quiet, dim bedroom, something unthinkable began, the first true breath of healing. The house felt different after Sophie's first real bite of food, not louder and not brighter, but alive in a way it had not felt in months. Like a window had been cracked open just enough for air to move again. Jessica stayed beside Sophie until her breathing softened to sleep, her small hand still gripping a fold of Jessica's sweater. James sat on the edge of the bed, fighting against the weight of everything he had just heard, his mind replaying his daughter's confession over and over. He tried not to cry again, but the emotion was too raw, the truth too heavy. He kept one hand gently on Sophie's back, terrified that if he lifted it even for a moment, she might disappear again into the silence she had been drowning in. When Jessica finally stood to step into the hallway, James followed her, quietly, closing the door only an inch, so he could hear if Sophie stirred. They stepped into the dim upstairs landing, where the city lights flickered through the high windows like distant stars. Jessica leaned her back against the wall, letting out a long, shaking breath she had held for too long. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but she stayed composed because she knew James was unraveling, standing only a few feet away. She could see his shoulders trembling, and she understood without him saying anything that a father had just learned the most terrifying truth. A parent could hear that his little girl wanted to leave the world, to stop the pain, to disappear into the heaven where she believed her mother was waiting. James pressed his palms against his face, his voice muffled when he finally spoke. "She thought she was making it easier for me." He whispered like he could not believe the words, even as he said them. "She thought leaving would help me." Jessica stepped closer, not touching him, but close enough for him to feel he was not alone. "Children do not have adult logic," she said softly. "They do not understand time or healing, or what loss does to a parent. They only understand feelings, and they think if someone they love disappears, maybe they should follow." James dropped his hands and stared at the floor like he was looking for the moment everything had gone wrong. "I kept telling myself I was protecting her," he murmured, "but all I did was hide, and she felt abandoned." They walked slowly toward the small sitting room at the end of the hallway, where the glow of the city reflected off the glass walls. James sank into a chair as if his legs could no longer hold him. Jessica sat across from him, her hands clasped together in her lap, calm but heavy with understanding. "When my mother died," she said quietly, "my grandmother tried so hard to make me feel better. She brought food, toys, took me to the park, but none of it helped. Not until she sat down one day and said, 'I miss her too,' and she cried with me. And that was the first time I realized it was okay to feel broken." James listened, hanging on every word, like her story was the map he had never known how to read. Jessica continued in that same gentle, steady tone. "Grief does not need to be fixed, it needs to be shared. And Sophie needed you to sit with her in the hurt, not stand beside it pretending to be strong." James pressed a hand over his mouth, fighting another wave of tears. "I thought if I broke down in front of her," he said, "I would scare her. I thought being strong meant holding everything in." Jessica shook her head. "Being strong sometimes means letting a child see you cry so they know they are safe to cry too," she said. "And right now she needs you. She needs you to show up honestly, not perfectly, but truthfully." James looked up at her eyes, shining with a mix of fear and gratitude. "You saved her," he said, voice low and cracked. Jessica met his gaze and answered softly, "No, she saved herself. I only opened a small door for her, but you must be the one who walks through it with her." She watched him breathe slowly, letting the truth sink in. He was a billionaire used to fixing problems with money, power, and speed. But grief had humbled him, broken him. And now rebuilding would take something much harder: patience, and presence, and vulnerability. They stayed in the sitting room until the sky outside shifted from deep blue to pale morning gray. Neither of them slept. James kept replaying Sophie's words, and Jessica kept replaying the moment the girl reached for the second bite, that small, fragile act of choosing to stay. As dawn touched the edges of the city, Jessica rose from her chair. "I should check on her," she said softly. James stood too instinctively, needing to be near his daughter. They walked back to Sophie's room quietly, and when they opened the door, they found her curled in the same spot, but her face relaxed, her breathing deep and steadier, small fingers still loosely holding a bit of Jessica's sweater from the night before. Jessica moved gently to the side of the bed, lifting Sophie's hand and tucking it under the blanket. James knelt beside the bed, brushing a strand of hair from his daughter's forehead with a tenderness that surprised even him. He had always loved her, but for months his love had been quiet, afraid, hidden beneath the weight of loss. Now he touched her as if she were a miracle he almost lost. Jessica watched him and felt something steady in her chest, a sense that this was the moment healing had truly begun, not with food, but with truth spoken in a dark room. When they stepped back into the hallway, James leaned against the wall, eyes closed. "I was so close to losing her," he whispered, the words coming out thin and broken. Jessica nodded. "But you didn't," she said, "and every day from now you show her that you are staying right here." James opened his eyes, meeting hers deeply. "How?" she asked. "How do I show her?" Jessica smiled softly. "You sit with her, you read to her, you talk. Even when she does not talk back, you make grilled cheese on Sundays. You let her feel everything, and you feel it with her." James nodded slowly, letting each instruction sink in like a lifeline. They walked downstairs together, the penthouse quieter than usual, but it was no longer the dead quiet of grief. It was the fragile quiet of a house that had cried and now needed rest. Mrs. Chun was already in the kitchen, wiping her eyes when she saw them. She asked Jessica only with her expression, and Jessica nodded a small, tired but hopeful nod that meant, "Sophie ate." Sophie cried. "Sophie is still here." The older woman covered her mouth, sobbing softly. And in that moment, James realized something that made his chest ache. Jessica had not brought magic. She had not used psychology or expensive strategies. She had used the one thing his daughter truly needed: presence. Presence without pressure, love without expectation, grief shared and understood. And for the first time since losing his wife, he let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, his little girl would come back to him day by day, breath by breath, bite by bite. Morning light crept slowly across the Oliver penthouse, turning the walls pale gold, and waking the house in a soft, careful way as if it knew everyone inside had cried through the night. Jessica stepped quietly into the kitchen, still wearing the same sweater Sophie had clung to. She started the coffee machine and stood, breathing in the warm, rising scent. She felt different, almost lighter, but also more aware, more protective. Saving a child's life, even in the smallest way, changed you. Mrs. Chun entered, wiping her eyes, already knowing without asking that something had shifted. Jessica nodded gently. "Yes, she is still with us." And Mrs. Chun covered her mouth, letting out a breath she had been holding for 2 weeks. Upstairs, James sat beside his daughter's bed, watching her sleep. Her little chest rose and fell in a soft, steady rhythm, and he found himself counting each breath, afraid to miss one. He touched her hair gently, remembering the girl she was before the accident. Wild, giggling, full of sunshine, and tiny bare feet running across the marble floors. He whispered, "I am here, sweetheart. I am not going anywhere." His voice cracked, but he said it again and again, letting the truth settle into the room like a promise he should have made months ago. When Sophie finally opened her eyes, she blinked in surprise, seeing him still there, and something warm flickered faintly behind her tired expression. Jessica knocked softly and stepped inside, carrying a small tray of warm milk and cut fruit, not expecting Sophie to eat it, but offering it anyway in the same gentle way her grandmother had offered food to her after her mother died. Sophie sat up slowly, leaning into the pillows. She looked at the fruit, and then at Jessica, as if seeing whether the moment from yesterday had been real or a fragile dream. Jessica sat beside the bed, leaving space for Sophie to choose. "You do not need to eat," she said softly, "only to know you are not alone." Sophie nodded, holding the blanket to her chest. Then, after a long moment, she picked up one tiny piece of apple and placed it between her lips. James covered his mouth, tears filling his eyes again. The day moved slowly like a recovering heartbeat. Sophie stayed near her father, following him from room to room, clutching his shirt like a child much younger, but James did not mind in the slightest. He carried her when she wanted and held her hand when she walked. He read to her even when she looked away. He sat beside her, even when she said nothing. Jessica watched it all with quiet relief, because she could see the shift happening, not loud and sudden, but fragile and real. She noticed Sophie leaning into him without fear for the first time since the funeral. She noticed James kneeling to her level, meeting her eyes instead of standing apart trying to be strong. By early afternoon, the penthouse felt different. Sunlight filled the windows without feeling heavy. The silence inside was no longer hollow. It felt like a warm blanket placed around the three of them. Sophie wandered into the living room, holding a stuffed bear she had ignored for months, and sat on the couch, curling against her father's side. It was not much, but it was something enormous. Jessica stood in the doorway watching the scene, her heart swelling. She knew grief was not fixed overnight. She knew Sophie could slip again into the sadness, but now she was no longer falling alone. Later that day, Jessica suggested a short walk downstairs to the indoor garden on the building's 10th floor, a space filled with ferns and soft, warm lights, a place Catherine used to love. James hesitated, but Sophie nodded slowly, still holding her bear. They stepped into the elevator together, the three of them moving like a small, fragile unit. Sophie clung to her father's hand, but she watched Jessica closely, as if drawing steady calm from her presence. When the elevator doors opened, the air smelled like flowers and warm earth. Sophie took a breath deeper than she had taken in weeks. Jessica found a small wooden bench and sat, leaving a space for Sophie. The girl climbed up slowly, sitting between them, her legs dangling. She looked at the plants, touching the leaves, one by one, like she was remembering how the world felt. Jessica did not rush her or ask questions. She let Sophie exist in quiet discovery. James watched his daughter with awe, realizing how much he had missed the tiny details of her curiosity. For a moment, Sophie looked up at the tall windows and whispered quietly, "Mommy liked this place." James felt his throat close, but he nodded. It was her favorite. Sophia leaned against him and whispered, "I want to remember her." Jessica exhaled softly, because those words meant everything. When they returned to the penthouse, Sophie seemed tired but not withdrawn. She followed Jessica into the kitchen and sat on the counter, swinging her small legs, while Jessica prepared a light dinner. James watched from the doorway, amazed at how naturally Sophie gravitated toward the nanny. It was not just comfort. It was recognition, the silent understanding of someone who had walked through loss and survived. Jessica handed Sophie a small bite of bread, and Sophie accepted it without hesitation. Mrs. Chun watched from the side, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "It feels like she is coming back, piece by piece." Evening came with soft golden light reflecting across the lake. Sophie curled beside her father again, listening while he read her a story she had once loved. Jessica sat nearby, cleaning up toys that had not been touched in months. Sophie's eyes drifted closed, and for the first time James saw her look peaceful, not empty, not numb, just carried by the warmth of two people who refused to leave her alone in her darkness. After she fell asleep, James looked at Jessica and whispered, "I do not know how to thank you." Jessica shook her head. "You do not need to thank me," she said quietly. "You just need to stay with her." As night settled, James walked Jessica to the hallway. The soft glow of the city danced across the glass walls of the penthouse, casting gentle shadows on their faces. He stopped and looked at her fully, as if really seeing her for the first time. Not as an employee, but as the person who had reached into the dark and pulled his daughter back. "You did something no one else could," he said, voice unsteady. "You saw her. You understood her pain when I could not." Jessica lowered her eyes, but he stepped closer, lifting her chin gently. "I am not saying this lightly, but you saved my little girl." Jessica breathed in slowly, feeling the weight of his gratitude but also the responsibility of what came next. She nodded because she understood something deeper than praise. Sophie was not healed. She was beginning, and beginnings were fragile. Jessica touched James's arm lightly. "She saved herself," she whispered. "I only reminded her she was still here." And with that, she turned toward the guest room, softly closing the door behind her, leaving. James, standing alone in the hallway, overwhelmed with gratitude, guilt, hope, and something else. Something growing in the quiet space between them, something he was not ready to name yet. 3 weeks passed like a slow thaw after a long winter each day, melting a little more of the ice around Sophie's heart. The child, who once sat silent and shrinking at the table, now ate small but steady meals, always with her father or Jessica beside her. Her cheeks grew rounder, her eyes brighter. She spoke softly at first, just a few words, then full sentences, appearing like shy birds, returning in spring. James watched every moment with stunned gratitude, carrying the awareness that he had come dangerously close to losing the little soul he loved most. He hovered over her in gentle ways, reading to her before bed, tucking her in, staying until she fell asleep, sometimes staying longer just watching her breathe. Jessica noticed the changes to small miracles hidden in everyday moments. Sophie began humming again while coloring. She asked Jessica to braid her hair in the mornings. She tugged on James's sleeve, wanting him to sit with her on the couch. She asked for grilled cheese every Sunday, the new ritual that anchored their little family. The house that once echoed with grief now held small, warm sounds, footsteps, laughter, the clink of dishes, the soft thud of a stuffed animal hitting the floor as Sophie played again. It felt like a soul returning to its body. Jessica watched her grow stronger and felt her own heart healing in ways she had not expected. One quiet afternoon, James found Jessica in the kitchen washing fruit for Sophie's snack. The air smelled like peaches and warm sunlight. He leaned on the counter, watching her hands move gently, the same hands that had held his daughter through her deepest pain. He spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb the peace she created. "I have been thinking about everything," he said. "How broken things were. How close I was to losing her." Jessica looked up, meeting his eyes with calm understanding. He stepped closer, his voice low. "You didn't just help her eat. You helped her want to stay. You taught me how to show up again." Jessica dried her hands slowly, her heart beating faster than she wished. She had grown to care deeply for James as much as she cared for Sophie, but she moved carefully, aware of the delicacy of their healing. She shook her head gently. "You were always the one she needed," she said. "I only reminded you how to reach her." James exhaled a soft laugh full of emotion. "Maybe," he said, "but you walked into this house when it was drowning, and you threw us a rope." He paused, searching her face. "I am not sure I know how to live without you now." Jessica's breath caught, but she stayed still, wanting him to say the words with clarity, not confusion. That night, while Sophie slept beneath a blanket patterned with stars, James and Jessica sat on the balcony overlooking the shimmering lake. The city lights flickered below, the soft hum of traffic drifting upward like a heartbeat. James leaned forward, elbows on his knees, struggling to articulate something fragile. "After Catherine died," he said quietly, "I forgot how to feel anything without hurting. I forgot how to be a father, but now you and Sophie, you to make me feel alive again." Jessica listened silently, then placed a hand over his gently. Her touch was light, but steady. "You were grieving," she said. "Grief makes even strong hearts collapse for a while. But here you are, picking up every piece." James turned toward her, eyes full of that quiet hope she had watched grow day by day in the months that followed, their lives intertwined more naturally than anyone expected. Sophie flourished. She laughed easily. She painted pictures of her mother that she placed on her bedroom wall, and Jessica helped her talk about the memories instead of hiding from them. James took her to the park again, pushing her on the swings until she squealed the same way she had before the accident. Jessica walked beside them, carrying snacks and their coats, smiling at their joy. One day after school, Sophie ran to Jessica's arms, open, yelling, "Miss Jessica," like she had known her since birth. James watched them and felt something rise inside him, something warm and certain. Another Sunday morning came golden and calm. The kitchen filled with the familiar smell of butter and frying bread. Sophie stood on a stool, flipping her tiny grilled cheese sandwich, while Jessica guided her hand. James stood behind them, watching the scene with his heart full to the brim. When breakfast was ready, they sat together at the table, sunlight pouring through the windows, a picture of healing that once felt impossible. After they ate, Sophie looked up at them with shy curiosity. "Why do you two smile at each other like that?" she asked. Jessica almost choked on her juice, and James covered his mouth, hiding a laugh. "Because, sweetheart," he said, "sometimes healing brings people together in unexpected ways." Later that afternoon, when Sophie napped, James found Jessica in the living room, folding blankets. He approached her, slowly, the way a person approaches something precious. "I need to tell you something," he said softly. She looked up, and he felt his pulse quicken. "These past months, you've become family, not just to Sophie, but to me. You brought us back to life." Jessica's eyes softened, but she stayed very still. James' continued, voice trembling, "I care about you deeply, more than I expected, more than I thought I was allowed to feel again." Jessica's breath caught. She stepped closer, placing a hand over his heart. "And I care about you," she whispered. "You and Sophie both. Their foreheads touched, grief and healing woven together in the quiet space between them. The kind of moment where two broken stories began stitching themselves into one. Weeks later, James asked Jessica to walk with him to the rooftop garden. The sky was soft purple turning into night. Sophie followed beside them, swinging her little hand between theirs. When they reached the center of the garden, James knelt down, pulling a small velvet box from his coat. Sophie gasped, clapping her hands. Jessica froze, tears already forming. James looked up at her with a tenderness that filled the whole space. "You walked into my darkest chapter," he said, "and you brought my little girl back to me. You brought me back to myself. I never believed I could love again, but I love you, Jessica, with everything I have left. Will you marry me?" Jessica covered her mouth, sobbing as she nodded yes, and Sophie jumped into her arms, shouting, "We are a family now." James slipped the ring onto Jessica's shaking hand and pulled both of them close. Tears mixed with laughter, grief mixed with joy, loss mixed with new beginnings. The three of them stood together under the city sky, the broken pieces of their lives finally forming something whole. That night before bed, Sophie drew a picture. Three figures holding hands under a yellow sun, and above them a smiling woman in the clouds watching. She handed it to Jessica, whispering, "Mommy is happy now." Jessica knelt, pulling her close. "I think she is too, baby," she said, feeling the truth settled deep inside her heart. The family with empty plates and silent rooms had become a family with warmth and light and grilled cheese on Sundays. The girl who had once wanted to disappear had chosen to live, and the nanny who arrived with nothing but compassion had become the missing piece they never knew they needed. If this story touched your heart, stay with us for more emotional, true-to-life narratives that remind us how fragile and beautiful healing can be. Subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps bring more stories like this to light. And remember, you never know whose life you could change simply by showing up.